between English people who lived in the home island and those who resided in the colonies. Second, they required that colonies operate under no laws that were repugnant to the laws, statutes, customs, and rights of our Kingdom of England, and thereby powerfully implied that the laws of England were to provide the model and the standard for all colonial laws. Third, beginning with the Charter to Maryland in 1632, they also stipulated that colonies should use and enjoy all privileges, franchises, and liberties of our Kingdom of England freely, quietly, and peacefully to have and possess in the same manner as our liege men born are to be born within our said Kingdom of England, and thereby guaranteed that no laws would be passed without the consent of the freemen of the colony. In no case more than 20 years after the founding of a colony, and often much earlier, these conditions and developments encouraged the establishment of representative institutions. By 1660, all 13 settled colonies in the Americas had functioning representative assemblies. From New England to Barbados, colonial English America proved to be an extremely fertile ground for parliamentary governance. Even in situations in which company officials or proprietors took the initiative in establishing these early lawmaking bodies, they demonstrated a determination to cast themselves as the provincial equivalents of the English House of Commons. Usually from their very first beginnings, they acted as the aggressive spokesman for the proliferating settlements within the colonies. Claiming their constituents' rights to the traditional English principles of consensual governance, they early insisted that no laws or taxes might go into effect without their consent, demanded the initiative in legislation, turned themselves into high courts of appeal and original jurisdiction in the manner of the medieval House of Commons, and rarely shrank from controversy with local executives, proprietors, or the Crown. By the end of the second quarter of the 17th century, the tradition of consensual governance was thus firmly rooted in colonial English America. Yet, this development did not completely settle the issue of the structure of English colonial governance. Most of the new proprietary colonies created during the Restoration in the Carolinas, the Jerseys, and Pennsylvania, and the new royal colony of New Hampshire, separated from Massachusetts in 1679, quickly moved to institute the sort of consensual polities that had developed in the older colonies. But some Crown officials remained suspicious of this developing form of colonial governance, and when the Duke of York, the future James II, became proprietor of the colony of New York after its capture from the Dutch in the mid-1660s, he resisted the creation of an assembly for nearly 20 years until 1683, and immediately reversed this concession when he became king. Moreover, James II's attempt to consolidate the New England colonies into a single polity, the Dominion of New England, without representative institutions, deeply threatened the long-established tradition of representative government in those colonies. Such actions were part of a more extensive effort by London officials during the Restoration to impose metropolitan authorities upon the local centers of power that had emerged in America. Throughout the decades from 1660 to 1690, the metropolitan government undertook a variety of measures intended to reduce the colonies to what it called an absolute obedience to the king's authority. These included establishing a permanent body in London charged with colonial oversight, subordinating the economies of the colonies to that of the metropolis through the Navigation Acts passed between 1651 and 1696, bringing as many as possible of the still mostly private colonies under the direct control of the Crown, curtailing the power of colonial political institutions, and persuading the colonies to grant permanent revenues to support Crown authorities in the colonies. As a theoretical support for these efforts, metropolitan officials in the late 1670s enunciated the new doctrine that the extension of representative government to the colonies was an act of royal grace and not a matter of right. Everywhere in the colonies, and I mean everywhere, these metropolitan intrusions into colonial affairs encountered stiff resistance. In response, provincial assemblies expressed the determination of the property holders they represented to secure both their estates and their claims to an English identity by obtaining metropolitan recognition that as English people, or the descendants of English people, they were entitled to enjoy all the rights and legal protections of English people in the home island. This determination stimulated an extensive constitutional discussion intended to identify explicit legal defenses that would put colonial claims to English rights and legal protections on a solid foundation, and thereby protect the colonies from such wholesale intrusions of metropolitan power. In these discussions, colonial spokesmen articulated an elaborate argument designed to strengthen their early claims to what they thought of as their inherited rights as English people. According to this argument, the original settlers and their descendants were all equally free-born English subjects who had left their native country to establish English hegemony over portions of the New World. Denying that they could lose any of their inherited rights simply by migrating to America, they pointed out that they had created their own civil governments with the specific purpose of securing those rights to themselves. At the same time, they argued that so far from being a grant from the Crown, their assemblies derived from their basic English right to representative government and many decades of customary practice. No charter or other instrument could grant the English people a right to which they already enjoyed as part of their inheritance, they contended. Such instruments, like Magna Carta in England itself, merely constituted an acknowledgement on the part of the Crown that such rights inhered in the people themselves. Although London officials did manage to subordinate much of the colonial trade to the Navigation Acts during the first 4 decades following the Glorious Revolution of 1689, to bring all but 5 of the private colonies under royal authority, they had limited success in their efforts to bring colonial polities under tighter metropolitan supervision, or to diminish the extensive authority over provincial affairs long enjoyed by the colonial assemblies. In this effort, they were hampered by distance, limited investments of time, money, and expertise in imperial oversight, a sometimes inefficient colonial administration in London, a tiny bureaucracy in the colonies, and powerful colonial sensitivities about any challenges to colonial rights. They proved no more than an even match for provincial political establishments, which used their control over taxation and legislation to protect and expand local legislative authority within their respective polities. Indeed, the Glorious Revolution and the overthrow of the Dominion of New England effectively ended any metropolitan efforts to do away with representative government in the colonies. And by the time of the American Revolution, 25 provincial parliaments, not counting the Irish Parliament, were functioning in the British overseas world. Nevertheless, the Crown's continued refusal to accept the colonial contention that representative government in the American colonies was an inherited right improved by local custom meant that the legal and constitutional status of the assemblies remained a hotly and frequently contested issue down to and in the non-revolting colonies long after the American Revolution. The result of this stalemate was that the exact nature of the imperial constitution of the British Empire remained unsettled and open to divergent interpretations. This situation reveals the important extent to which the early modern British Empire was a negotiated empire. That is, the distribution of authority within the empire took shape in response to a continuing process of bargaining in which, contrary to metropolitan theory, custom and precedents produced a system of governance in which the metropolis of necessity held the reins of empire loosely. The provincial establishments constructed during the earliest generations of settlement retained extraordinary vitality. Free settlers enjoyed enormous agency and exerting wide authority over their internal governance, individual polities in America had wide scope to adapt their British inheritance to the peculiar situations in which they found themselves, thereby ensuring that while they were all unmistakably British, they differed considerably one from another. This system worked well for both Britain and the colonies, the latter exhibiting many indications of substantial development in all areas of provincial life, and contributing substantially to Britain's own internal economic growth and expanding national power in the competition for overseas empire. In response to the growing importance of the colonies to British maritime and commercial life and domestic economic expansion, the British government increasingly after 1730 and especially after 1750 invested considerably more public funds in the colonizing enterprise than it had ever done before, contributing heavily to the founding of new colonies in Georgia and Nova Scotia, providing more substantial naval and military protection for colonial shipping and against restive enslaved peoples in the colonies most dependent on their labor, and expanding enormous resources for and expending enormous colonial resources during and after the 7 Years' War. Yet the settler population itself, exhibiting a high birth rate and augmented by scores of new immigrants, continued to drive territorial and demographic expansion, economic growth, and social development, and relations with indigenous peoples. In the process, carrying British common law culture as it had been modified in colonial situations over significant areas of North America, and thereby contributing to the emergence of an empire, the outstanding success of which most observers attributed to its commercial and free character. Traditional bonds of affection and expanding ties of commerce, communication, and culture ensured that the colonists would be closely and happily bound to Britain so long as metropolitan officials did not violate established systems of negotiated authority, and continued to respect the delicate balance between central and peripheral interests on which those systems were based. However, when acting contrary to the principles of negotiation, the metropolitan government after 1750 sought to new model the British Empire. It met profound resistance from all those colonies that were neither dependent on the British government for protection against their own slaves, nor completely vulnerable to attack from the British Navy. After a dozen years of intermittent confrontation, the British government's decision in 1775 to use force to put down that resistance produced the settler revolt that led in 1783 to the independence of 13 British American colonies, the retrocession of 2 others to Spain, and the creation of the United States. Singled out by Adam Smith in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations as one of the 2 principal causes for the rapid proliferation of the British colonies in America, the dispersal of authority within the British Empire was only one of the predominant features of the British colonial system. The second cause Smith cited was the seemingly unlimited availability of land and its dispersal among a remarkably wide section of the settler population. Of course, the very concept of available land, or empty, underutilized land, implied a casual disregard for the rights of indigenous populations.